Excellent. Good morning, everyone. We have the privilege of studying the Haftarah for Parashat Bechukotai, which is Jeremiah, chapter 16, verse 19, all the way through chapter 20. I'm sorry, all the way through chapter 17, verse 14. Um, and by the way, let's start at the end of this Haftarah. Um, we've seen this a couple times where the prophet, where Chazal, our rabbis, when they frame the Haftorah, they use it as a tool of rhetoric as opposed to maybe being totally authentic with what the text means. So, for example, that we want the Haftorah to generally end on a happy note, right? So, the last verse of the Haftorah is a happy note. Rafa'eni Hashem be'erafeh. Heal me, Hashem, and I'll be healed. Hoshieni ve'evashaya. Save me, and I shall be redeemed. I shall be saved. Ki tehilati ata, for you are my praise, my salvation, my prayer. Beautiful verse, right? We actually say it in tefillah, right? It's a beautiful verse. And it ends there. And that's such a beautiful, stirring sentiment. Save me, God. You're my savior. Heal me, God. You're my healer. But the rest of it continues on and goes, why? Because everyone else is out to get me. And all the people want to hurt me. And all my enemies are trying to destroy me. And God says, don't worry, blah, blah, blah. But our Haftorah uses it as such a high point, but it's really the preamble to a much bigger sort of speech and oration, which obviously our rabbis, when they chose the Haftorah and they scripted the breaks, they knew that, but they wanted to use this in almost subversive is too strong a word, but just in a plain letter as opposed to the context. So it's just another example. We saw that last week as well, sort of where the Haftorah ends, and it's a classical technique when you're trying to hew out a message. Sometimes you sort of break the parsha, break the haftorah in a certain place that I wouldn't say it changes the meaning. It distorts the meaning a little bit for their own, very intentionally. Like this isn't like, oh, someone did the wrong page break, right? This was very intentional location where they break the haftorah. So I wanted to start with that. We saw that last week as well, and we see that other times. It's important to know. All of this Haftorah, as well as some of the other ones, Haftorah for Parashat Tzav, I believe, the Haftorah for before Tisha B'Av, are all from the section of Yirmiyahu, which is a sefer of rebuke, a area of the book that focuses on tochacha, rebuke for the Jewish community and for their sins. And that obviously connects nicely is the wrong word, but aptly with our parsha, which is also talks about the tochacha. But our rabbis actually bring out more of a direct connection, again, trying to measure the good and the bad. Our parsha is primarily taken up by the tochacha, but there are a number of blessings at the beginning of our parsha that lead into tochacha. If you do follow the mitzvot, if you do the right things, then X, Y, and Z. And if you don't, then we get to Tocha. We get that in this Haftorah as well, that choice. Verse 5. Ko'amar Hashem, 17:5. Ko'amar Hashem, so says Hashem. Aror hagever asher yiftach ba'adam. Person is the person who trusts in God. I'm going to pause the recording for a second. So we were just saying that this connects to the notion of the curses and the blessings, the brachot in Bechukotai. We see that over here. Person be the person who trusts in a mortal and a human, Bisam basar zro, and makes flesh his arm, meaning focuses on flesh and blood. Hashem yasur levavo, and livo, and from God departs his heart, meaning turns away from trusting God, right? And we'll get to the metaphor in a second. But then concurrent with that, it's not just a cursing. Verse 7, Baruch HaGever Asher Yiftach B'Hashem. Blessed be the person who trusts in God. And God will be his. God will be either God will protect them or they hope in God. We'll come to that later. But that sort of double way of looking at the curses and the blessings match parallel nicely with our Haftorah, with our Parsha, which talks about brachot and klalot as well. And that is possibly what connects this Haftorah as well to our Parsha. Let's go back to the beginning. Hashem uzi umauzi minusi biyom sarah. God is my strength, my stronghold, my place of fleeing, my minusi, my place of fleeing, like my refuge, my refuge
in
in biyom sarai, my day of affliction. But you see where we get refuge, right? The etymology of that is like to run away. We see that shorish here. That's the place where I run away, which in English is the refuge. Goyim yavo mi'aseh aretz. All the nations of the world will recognize that God is this source of refuge, of strength, of protection. V'yomru, and they will say, Ach sheker nachlu avotenu. Our fathers, our ancestors have brought us lies. They've inherited us. We've inherited lies. Hevel ve'en ba'moel. Hevel, folly, that don't help us at all, right? Hayaselo, and at this point, what are these lies? What are we referring to? Which lies are they? What folly have they brought them that doesn't work? It could be lots of things, but the next verse makes that very clear. Hayaselo Adam Elohim, Behema Lo Elohim. Can a person make a god and they're not a god? Meaning, what inheritance do the nations one day will recognize the chief folly that they have been inherited from their parents, from their legacy? Idolatry, the trust in other gods. Lachen, therefore, heneni modi'an b'pam hazot. I will let them know. I will notice them. At this once, odiem et yadi. I will make my hand, my might noticed, that givurati, and my courage, my strength, the ki shemi Hashem, and they'll know that my name is God. Part of what's going on here is Yirmiyahu is castigating the people for their sin and saying all of this prophecy is coming, we generally assume, on the back of the son of the great king Yoshiyahu, whose name is Yehoiakim, who was not a great leader. Yoshiyahu was. Yoshiyahu was a great leader, and Yehoiakim sort of reverts back to Yoshiyahu, from Yoshiyahu. Interestingly, he even aligns himself with Par Necho, which the power from the south against the conquering enemy from the north. Par Necho is the pharaoh that kills his father. Yoshiyahu is killed in battle against the Egyptians. It's based on a verse that we read in our Parsha this week. In peace times, lo savur chereb artzachem, or lo savur chereb artzachem, a sword won't pass through your midst in times of peace. Yoshiyahu was convinced that the people were doing the right thing and that this verse applied to them, even though Yirmiyahu begged him to not do that. So he stood up and didn't let Par Necho pass his army through the Judean province. And he ends up dying in battle. We read on Tisha B'Av the keynote for him, and we describe that he ultimately recognized he was a great king. He ultimately recognized that even in that moment, there was a mistake made, and that God was right. Hashem hu tzaddik, right? We actually have maybe a whole chapter of Eicha, of Lamentations, dedicated to Yoshiyahu from Yirmiyahu, because Yoshiyahu was this great, this Messiah-like figure that could save the people, put them on the straight and narrow. He was doing all of these good things, but even good leaders make mistakes. and that's part of what happens here. Um, this is his son. His son restores all the false altars in Geben Hinnom in the valley outside Jerusalem for worship of Molech and Tophet and the Baalim and all the various different things. So he's bad news. This is what this Haftarah is talking about during this time. And the Haftarah begins, Yirmiyahu begins his prophecy saying, all the nations will one day recognize God. And yet, you, the Jewish people who already have God, who were not given a false inheritance like other nations, you choose to turn away from God, right? That's a very serious castigation of the Jewish people. And therefore, the promise of punishment speaks for itself. Then we get this next part. Baruch, let's go on. That's the end of 16. Chatat Yehuda Ketuva Be'et Barzel. The sin of Yehuda is written in a iron tab. Bitziporen Shamir Harusha Luach Libab, with a strong stone, maybe a diamond. It is engraved on the tablet of their heart. Lekarnot mizbechotechem, and on the corners of your altars, meaning all this false idolatry, all this false worship of idols comes up. Kizocher b'neihem mizbechotam, as they remember their children, they remember their altars, right? This is a reference to Molech, right? Where you sacrifice your children, where you're actually murdering your children to Molech, or some scholars want to think that you're just passing them between the fire. They're not actually being burned. There's some who want to read some of the verses as reading that. I'm not an expert in idolatrous practices, so I can't tell you one way or another. The al eitz ranan. It would make more sense that like you didn't kill your children if it was going to be such a popular cult in Israel. But all right. Verse 5. Let's get to verse 5. Komar Hashem. So says Hashem. Arur hagever shirtach ba'adam. Cursed is the person who trusts only in humans. The Sam basar zra'o umi Hashem yasur libo, and turns his heart from God and makes, thinks it's all about his own hand. V'haya, and he'll be like a tree in the desert, ba'arava, below yireh ki yavo tov, and they will not see good times come. B'shachen ha'reirim, and it will bamidbar, it will inhabit a space of parched lands, dryness. Eretz milecha, a salted earth, meaning there's so much lack of water that the salt has sort of it's totally non plantable. Below Teshev, and it won't be inhabited, right? That's not a great place to be, right? Baruch HaGever Asher Yiftach B'Hashem. Blessed be the person who trusts in God. V'haya Hashem Miftacho, and God's how would you translate that last part? How would you
then Hashem will be his security.
Right. Right. So one way to read that is just as he trusts in God, so too God will be security and a help for God. Others present it more as And that I think is many of the commentaries. Some of them present not that God will assure that things will be okay, but that will be God, that will be their hope, right? It's still focused on an individual. God will be this person's hope, meaning the commentaries sort of want to balance, right? On the one hand, Baruch HaGever Shevtach Hashem, someone who trusts in God, does God always save them? Right? There's always that inherent sort of challenge. What happens in those moments? And it's a very real question about some of these verses about what they're referring to. So some just render the entire verse differently. Baruch HaGever Shevtach Hashem, blessed be the person who trusts in God, and God is his hope. The hope in God is what protects him, which is very similar to the verse that we're talking about, right? In verse 5, there's no promise from God of something, of punishment, right? So says God, Arura Gever, cursed be the person who does X, Y, and Z. Not, and then God will do X, Y, and Z too, right? So you could read them both ways. But what happens to that person? Verse 8, this will be like a person, a tree planted on waters, yuval, that has its roots system spread out, velo yireh kiavochom, and they won't be afraid or they won't see when the heat comes. That's a question about whether we read that as the Kri Uktiv. Is it Yud Resh Aleph or Yud Resh Aleph Hey? Right? Does that mean they will not fear when the heat comes because they'll be rooted on the ground, or they will not see when he comes because they're in a great place? Vaya Aleu Ra'anan. And their place, their trees, their canopy will be tranquil. And in the years of thirst, of drought, of lack, lo yid'ag, they won't have to be worried. Vo yamish me'asot peri, and they won't have to cease from yielding fruit, meaning things will be good, right? So we have these two descriptions. Is there another time we have these descriptions? Have you ever heard this description about someone being compared to a tree planted on water? Let me read for you Psalm Tehillim Aleph. Psalm number 1, verse 1, like the very beginning of Tehillim. Ashrei ish asher lo halach b'atzad rishayim. Blessed be the person who doesn't follow the path of the wicked. Verse number 2, I'm skipping a little bit. Ki im b'torat Hashem chafso, for they focus on the Torah of Hashem. Ub'torato yehegeh yomam v'layla, and in God's Torah, or in his Torah, he focuses night and day. And he'll be like a tree planted on a spring of water. Asher pirio yitem b'ito v'aleo lo yibo v'cho asher yaseh latzliach. And everything, he'll be like a water on a well, like a tree planted on a stream of water. That fruit is brought in its season, and the leaves never wither, and everything that happens is good, right? Right. That seems very, very similar, right? Very similar. Yirmiyahu, this is another example where Yirmiyahu is playing on other places in Tanakh and using their metaphors and their analogies or their similes. Vayakeh, this is similar. What's the point of using it? Is there a common connection? Well, let's talk about what the difference is. What is the person being credited for in our Torah? Why do they get this thing? What do they have to do?
Follow Hashem, believe in.
Trust in God. What did the Tehillim? Ki im b'Torat Hashem chafso, because they study the Torah. U'b'Torato yageh yomam b'layla. And they trust and they study Torah day and night. So we see, I wouldn't say a divergence, but two different ways of presenting this metaphor. One, or the simile, excuse me, I keep saying metaphor, but it's really a simile because it says ke. My English teacher, Mrs. Greer, would be upset for my confusing those two things. High school English teacher. So on the one hand, we have two different tracks to this. There are people who trust in God and the people who study Torah. Yirmiyahu, Tanakh knows that you know both of these, right? They're very clear, the same words, right? Shatul is this very unique word. There are other ways to say planted. You can say nata, you can say, there are all these different shorashim. Shatul is a very clear sort of throw to these two different examples. So number one, we've talked about this over and over and over again. It highlights the fact that the study of Torah and the way you behave and the trust in God and sort of the other part, the emotional part of that connection to God, they're both two sides of the same coin, right? They're highlighted and they're connected together, right? And the fact that Yirmiyahu is using both is very clear that there are two ways to this, and there are two parts to that. But I think it's a little bit even a little bit more. It's interesting in that the Yirmiyahu is also playing on a vision, perhaps, that Yecheskel has. Yecheskel describes a vision of a tree irrigated by water emanating from the Beit HaMikdash, from the temple, which also constantly blooms and yields fruit. What's interesting to note is what is in the Kodesh Kodashim, what's in the heart of the Holy of Holies. The first one's easy, the second one's not.
You mean something beside the ark?
There's the ark. What's in the ark?
The tablets from the second set of tablets.
The Torah. You have the Torah. That's one of these images, Torah. And that the stream Yirmiyahu is also, and Yecheskel is also, and Tehillim is also playing on this image that if you trust in Torah, you follow Torah, you study Torah, you'll be planted like a tree, irrigated from a spring from the divine. What's the second thing that's in the Aron? That's in the Holy of Holies, excuse me.
Besides what was in the ark, we're told that a jar of manna was
exactly a jar of man. What does man represent?
Food. So,
but not just food.
Faith that God will take care
The
of.
faith
In God, it's food, but it represents a perfect demonstration that food comes straight from God, and there's that faith that you have to have in God. A person who trusts in God. What's the other requirement of this metaphor, of this simile? What does Yirmiyahu say? Baruch HaGever, not who studies Torah,
will forever be taken care of.
Who trusts in God. The Aman represents sort of the other representation of this notion, right? If you trust in God, you'll be taken care of. Man represents that. Man is literally the food that God provides miraculously for those who trust in God. That's going to be there. Now, our food today, we're trying to remember that our food is a step away from the man. The natural world requires us to work. Well, the same idea is supposed to be visited through our food as well. And I think that is the connection here. That the Torah, that we're connecting these two ideas. Trust in God, i.e. for your physical needs, like man represents, and a devotion to Torah. I want to add one more piece, which is fascinating. We make brachot all the time, right? We make a bracha on apples, on seeing dignitaries, on water, on traveling over an ocean. There are all these different brachot that we make. Which brachot are biblical? There are two brachot that are biblical, that have a halachic, a biblical basis.
benching,
right? Where do we know it's biblical?
because it says you will eat and you will be satisfied and you will
Right,
praise.
exactly. And you'll bless God. The chalta v'savatu birachta. The liturgy isn't biblical, meaning it doesn't say in the Torah you should say, the first paragraph and then Noda and then all the rest. But the idea of saying Birkat Hamazon is a biblical responsibility. What's the other one?
I don't remember.
Birkat HaTorah, blessing on Torah study. That also has a biblical obligation. Again, not the expression, not the exact formulation. Baruch atah Hashem, Asher bachar banu, or Lasok de Torah. That is rabbinic formulation. But the idea, the notion that you have to make a bracha on Torah is also biblical, right? The only two biblical verses, the only two biblical brachot that we have to make. The only two biblical brachot that we have to make, Birkat Torah and the Aliyah.
So, where is the Birkat HaTorah in the Torah?
The language, or where does it come from?
What is the source in the Torah for that?
So it comes from the Tochacha, actually. Tachat asher lo avayat Hashem b'simcha v'tol levav. The rabbis learn out there that shelo baruch hu b'Torah tchila.
Okay.
But either way, we have these two, and Birkat Hamazon is a much firmer source than the other ones, but it's interesting to note that Yirmiyahu is using the same language that we see in other places to highlight these two commitments to God, which are both two commitments that are associated with images or symbols that are put in the Holy of Holies, that also are the two biblical brachot that we're supposed to make. I think all of this sort of ties into presentation of the difference between Yehoiakim and Yoshiyahu, right? Our Haftarah talks about parents leading us astray, and that's part of this challenge here, meaning this bait and switch that Yoshiyahu, this switch between Yoshiyahu and Yehoiakim, the differences between the styles of the two leaders. Let's go on to one more point, and then we'll come back to this. So what's part of the punishment if we continue on? Kore dagar velo yalad, oseh osher velo b'mishpat. Like a bird sits on eggs but hatches them not. Gets riches but not b'mishpat, not with justice. Yamav will leave Yaz Venu Rachrito Yenaval. Will have days and it will leave them. And in the end, he will be, even though he has all these days, he'll be a naval, a fool, a wit. What's going on here? So some of the commentators point out that this is a type of bird that sits on eggs, but that didn't lay them, right? They're not their eggs, so they essentially steal the young, right? It's the offspring of another egg, and so again, the Navi is alluding to Yoakim, who in his days when this prophecy was delivered had this glorious palace that had been renovated, was enjoying a largesse at the expense of the plight of the people, and was living off of the restored kingdom that his father Yoshiyahu had provided, had created, had merited. And the prophet essentially says that in the end of the day, your years will be it'll be for naught. We actually ended up learning, we ended up seeing later on, Yehoiakim is a king, and he reigns for 11 years, from 25 to, what's 11 years later? '36, about, which is also a very short period, right? He lives a short life, right? And then the lifespan that they talk about in Navi is 70, 80 years, right? Or maybe even more. The Haftarah, as we already alluded to, likes to end on a positive note, which we see over here. Kisek, Kavod, Marom, Mirishit, Makom, Vishenu. Trying to think. As we already alluded to, the Haftarah likes to end on a high note. This becomes this place. But as I alluded to, right, the Haftarah word, it continued to the end of the chapter. Hine hema omrim elai ayed devar Hashem yavona. They're mocking me. When's God's word gonna come? Vani lo siti meroa acharecha. But I haven't moved from following after God. Yom anush lo yit aviti. And I haven't desired this day of punishment. Atayadata motza sifatai. You know what comes out of my mouth, God. Nochach panecha haya are all what you commanded me, God. Al tieli, don't let me be trapped in this day of terror. Machasi ata b'yom ra'ah. You have to be my refuge, my hope, oh God, in the day of evil that I am proclaiming, prophesizing to come. Yevoshu rodfai. Let my prosecutors, those who pursue me, become confounded and become embarrassed. Velo evosha ani, but don't let me be confused. Don't let it fall to me. Save me from the evil that will come and the double evil that will come on this moment that I've proclaimed. So we really see Yirmiyahu is this very tortured spirit, right? Our Haftarah sort of cuts off the challenge part, but he has real anxiety. There's all this bad stuff that's going to happen. God, please come and you have to come save me. All these other people are out to get me when they're coming. And that's really, it continues on and on. I don't want to get into the whole chapter here, but that our Haftarah sort of breaks that off so that we don't realize that. And again, that's very deliberate and very intentional. So that's our Haftarah. Again, it's one of these Haftarot that we're privileged to read, although we typically read this even when the heart of Bechukotai is connected. It uses some interesting ways of sort of where the Haftarah ends and begins to convey a more hopeful message, just like at the beginning. Hashem, Uzi, Mauzi, Menusi, Yom Sarah, this beautiful sort of call to God, of God being our salvation and our Savior, and all these different things. These rhetorical questions without the context of the whole first, 17 verses that describe the sins of the people that Yirmiyahu is castigating them for. We talked about the connection to our parsha, to the curse and the blessing that our parsha represents, and the unique way that Yirmiyahu deploys images that exist in other places of Tanakh to bolster sort of what is the expectation, what are the ways in which one is supposed to serve. So one of them is trusting in God, the other is studying Torah, and those represent these two poles that are both important for these prophecies, but as we highlighted, also have Berachot Torah, also have Brachot that we say on, that really all connect. We're going to stop here, and we'll see you all next week, if not sooner.
Okay, Rabbi?